If I remember correctly, EA struck a deal with Disney to acquire exclusive rights to the Star Wars license all the way back in May 2013. It feels like forever ago. Even back then, EA had a reputation for being one of the shittiest game publishers around, with their propensity for running franchises into the ground. So unsurprisingly, Star Wars fans and enthusiasts were apprehensive about Disney's decision to make a deal with the devil. Lo and behold, 2.5 years later, on November 2015, we would see this partnership yield its first flop in the form of Star Wars Battlefront, a game that, to many players' disappointment, shipped unfinished and woefully lacking in content. From there, another 2 years would pass before the launch of Star Wars Battlefront 2, a game that promised would learn from the mistakes of the first game to create the ultimate competitive Star Wars experience. However, we all know what happened with that game. Its pay-to-win loot boxes made waves across the internet, and the sense of pride and accomplishment response made history by becoming the most downvoted Reddit comment of all time. Word spread far enough that government officials eventually caught wind of this, and soon enough, countries around the world began rallying to enforce regulations against what are essentially disguised forms of glorified gambling. Fast forward to today, January 2019, almost 6 years after EA acquired the Star Wars license, and this is the legacy the notorious publisher has carved out thus far. Close to 6 long years have passed, and EA has nothing to show for it, leaving games industry pundits wondering how the hell EA continues to hold exclusive rights to the Star Wars license, and how the hell Disney let this happen. Now, if you've been keeping up with EA's Star Wars ventures, then you'll know that the company had also assigned a few more Star Wars games to a few other development studios under their umbrella. Chief among these studios was Visceral Games, best known for the Dead Space series. You may recall that they had been working on a brand new Star Wars game directed by legendary game director Amy Hennig, best known for leading the Uncharted series before joining Visceral. This Star Wars game, then known as Project Ragtag, was intended to be a linear, action-adventure, narrative-driven single-player Star Wars experience akin to Uncharted, and given the studio and people involved, there was tangible excitement surrounding it. But then, on October 2017, hopes and dreams were shattered when EA announced that they would be shutting down Visceral Games and that EA Vancouver would be taking over the project. Around that time, Kotaku released an investigative article detailing the series of events that led to Visceral's collapse, and while many factors on both the publishers and the developers' end contributed to this end result, it was also abundantly clear that EA had in many ways set Visceral up to fail by sidelining the studio following the lackluster commercial performance of Dead Space 3, and that EA made very little effort to keep Visceral alive. Adding insult to injury was that in their statement announcing the closure of Visceral Games, EA subtly emphasized that they would not be preserving the creative integrity of Visceral's Star Wars project, hinting that EA Vancouver would be rebooting it in order to transform the linear action-adventure narrative-driven single-player Star Wars game into an open-world Star Wars game that would allow for the implementation of live service functionalities. Just like that, sentiment surrounding this Star Wars game went from near universal excitement to pessimistic trepidation. Following Visceral's closure, we hadn't heard much more about the state of what was now EA Vancouver's Star Wars project. And although everyone knew it wasn't going to be the same game Visceral was working on, there was still some active curiosity about the project, with many hoping that for once, EA would launch a Star Wars game that was genuinely worth getting excited about. But fast forward to today, almost a year and 3 months after EA Vancouver took over what was once Visceral Star Wars game, and fans would be greeted with more bad news. The following information was reported by Kotaku's Jason Schreier, who published an article on January 15th, 2018, detailing that, according to 3 of his sources, EA Vancouver's open-world Star Wars game has also been cancelled. Not many additional details were provided beyond that, with the rest of the article mainly recounting past stories like the sequence of events that led to Visceral's shutdown. Jason did try to reach out to EA for comment on the report for more information, but the publisher did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Beyond that, the article also recounted how on June 2018, 2018, EA announced that it would be expanding the Montreal-based Motive studio into Vancouver and have it share the same office space as EA Vancouver, who was hard at work on the open-world Star Wars game. Motive Studio, in case you forgot, is an EA development studio founded back in July 2015 by Jade Raymond, meant to specialize in action-adventure games and the creation of new IPs. Motive began by lending a helping hand in finishing Star Wars Battlefront 2, but they eventually moved on to collaborate with Visceral to create the linear single-player Star Wars game prior to Visceral's closure. Now, a month after Motive's June 2018 expansion into Vancouver, on July 2018, Jade Raymond participated in interviews with media outlets to announce that Motive was working on what was described to be a new open-world action-adventure IP. So while Motive's Vancouver expansion was helping EA Vancouver finish the open-world Star Wars project, Motive's Montreal headquarters had started working on a brand new game. All of these signs seem to suggest that outlook was positive for Motive, but 3 months later, on October 22nd, 2018, out of the blue, news spread that Jade Raymond decided to leave EA, which happened right after EA appointed executive Samantha Ryan to oversee Motive. I actually reported on this news back then, and at the time, this sudden departure didn't make much sense to me. I wondered why Jade Raymond, who founded Motive only 3 years ago, and who seemed very excited about her studio's future, would suddenly abandon ship. But looking back now, it was perhaps around this time that some kind of paradigm shift occurred within Motive after EA appointed an executive to take over, possibly contributing to the eventual cancellation of the open-world Star Wars game. Anyway, going back to Kotaku's article, Jason at one point detailed what's next for EA Vancouver, with his initial reporting stating that from what he heard, it might be a different Star Wars project altogether. He also reminded readers that Respawn Entertainment is making a Star Wars game for EA in parallel called Jedi Fallen Order, which is slated for a fall 2019 release. A few hours after the article was first published, Jason updated it with new details about why the open-world Star Wars game was cancelled and how EA Vancouver will proceed going forward, relaying the following. Since the publication of this article, I've talked to several more people familiar with EA Vancouver's now cancelled open-world Star Wars game. This project, which was codenamed Orca, was very early in development, but would involve playing as a scoundrel or bounty hunter who could explore various open-world planets and work with different factions across the Star Wars universe. When EA's top decision makers looked at their roadmap for the next few years, they decided they needed something earlier than the planned release date for Orca, according to 2 people familiar with what happened. So they cancelled Orca in favor of a smaller scale Star Wars project that's now aimed for much sooner, likely late 2020, which also happens to be around the time that I've heard next-gen consoles will launch. Might be a bit earlier, might be a bit later. From what I've heard, next-gen plans are definitely still in flux. To EA's credit, those people said, the publisher did not lay anyone off as part of this transition. This news comes at a time of cost-cutting across the industry, and major publishers including both EA and Activision, as we have reported. Some at the studio also hope that Orca might be restarted after this new project is finished. Essentially, with EA being so intent on meeting their quarterly deadlines, they decided to cancel a large-scale Star Wars game that would take more time and effort to make, so that they could rush a lesser product to release by 2020 when next-gen consoles are expected to launch, which is just so classic Electronic Arts. It's widely known that EA is no stranger to being indifferent about rushing games to release for the sake of adhering to a strict schedule that will please investors. Games like Battlefront and Battlefront 2, Mass Effect Andromeda, and more recent releases like Battlefield 5 were all heavily criticized for shipping in a state that felt half-baked, incomplete, and compromised, with much of their content and features missing at launch. So it should hardly come as a surprise that the publisher would be willing to force a studio to scrap a project just to mandate a rush job product. I'm honestly wondering what's going through Disney's mind at this point. They must surely be aware that ever since the exclusivity deal was struck back in 2013, in the nearly 6 years that have elapsed, EA has done nothing but tarnish the Star Wars IP and invite overwhelmingly negative PR by releasing 2 unacceptably flawed Battlefront games, by shutting down a renowned studio helming a Star Wars game directed by a legendary game developer, and by canceling 2 different iterations of this Star Wars game. Almost 6 years into this licensing deal with EA, the Star Wars IP has been so poorly handled, so woefully underutilized, and so heavily abused that I'm surprised Disney hasn't stepped in already to cut this deal short. I'm not exactly sure how much more EA has to butcher the Star Wars name before Disney realizes they'd be much better off handing the license over to acclaimed studios with a track record of handling treasured franchises with some semblance of respect, passion, and care. Just to give you an idea of how inefficient and unproductive EA has been with Star Wars, check out this chart that Twitter user JediSpectre117 posted in response to a Jim Sterling tweet. During the 4 years that elapsed between 2002 and 2006, when the Star Wars license was under LucasArts and various other game companies, a grand total of 16 Star Wars games were released, and some damn good ones at that, including the 2 critically acclaimed Knights of the Old Republic games, as well as other beloved titles. But in the 4 years that elapsed between 2013 and 2017, after EA gained exclusive publishing rights to Star Wars games, a grand total of 2 games have been released, neither of them well received or leaving any kind of positive mark. So yeah, it couldn't be clearer that it's time for the Star Wars license to come under new creative leadership. Give the license over to Sony Interactive Entertainment, whose first-party studios are bound to cook up something incredible with it. Hell, give it to any number of talented game studios out there who have earned a reputation for showing pride and integrity in their work, or at the very least forego the exclusivity part of the deal so that other game companies can have a go at the opportunity to churn out a proper Star Wars game rather than a money-milking machine disguised as one. Just for the love of God, get Star Wars as far away as humanly possible from EA's clutches already, as those nincompoops clearly have no idea what the hell they want to do with it, or they are just too greedy and incompetent to be able to do anything positive with it. That's my take on this recent development anyway. I'd love to hear what your thoughts and opinions are on EA's recent handling of the Star Wars license in the comments below. With that, I would like to end this news update. Thank you for tuning in. To be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Yong Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Yong out.